Thank you. It's amazing to be part of a movement that actually owns a color and that various people want to help, redefine. I'm just going to blurt out what I want to talk about here. The future of the green movement over the next, let's say, half century. I think it's going to keep expanding because it's already got this broad appeal. Science keeps getting better. And there is actually growing hazard to be green about, especially related to climate change. Two major things going on in this half century that I think are going to be forcing this are climate change and urbanization. Furthermore, because of that, civilization basically as a whole is being perceived as a hazard, and that then puts greens in position of much greater import and power, and because of that, some opinions will probably need to change because you start looking at things like cities, overpopulation, genetic engineering, and nuclear power in a new light. I think it's helpful to think of three kinds of environmentalists. There's romantics, like John Muir and Dave Brower. I'll come back to also there's scientists and there's engineers. And as there are more scientists and more engineers, things are going to change somewhat. But the romantics are absolutely majority. These are people who feel nature, feel one with nature, and basically distrust anything that is perceived as unnatural. Because of this deep personal engagement, a sort of a faith-like engagement, romantic environmentalists are very slow to change their mind and never admit mistakes. But the appeal is huge, and I'll just go down through some of the things that are characteristic in a slightly critical version of this movement. The appeal is, look, it really does celebrate immersing in nature. It's as much fun as whipping your guitar. It does raise important and legitimate questions about all the forms of the headlong progress, which is getting more and more intense, as Kevin Kelly was pointing out. It offers the comforts of a worldview which is wonderfully inclusive. It includes politics, it includes economics, it includes all kinds of aesthetics. And it does provide all kinds of paths of satisfaction in political action, direct action, which have lasting effects. So a big part of what this vast movement has got going for it is the ability and the desire to organize. Now, my friend Paul Hawken has been researching locally based organizations about two things, social justice and environmental protection. All over the world, all places that Tom Friedman goes, there are these organizations bubbling up. And they pretty much merge social justice and environmental issues. And some are more about one, some more about the other, but they completely lock together. They fly below the radar. They're not turning up in the daily or monthly type news that we see very much. But there's so many of them. There's a groundswell about to probably burst on global consciousness, and Paul's working on that as the subject of his next book. Let me give a sample of the kind of thing that Paul Hawken is finding. These are everywhere. They're active, they're political, they're effective. And here's a sampling of who these people are. It'll go on for a minute or 2 years, so it's worth studying. people against pollution. Columbia, Mississippi. Everybody wants to borrow that slide, that little video, and Paul loaned it to me because I originally set up the talk called The Long Green that he originally gave it for. This database that they're collecting, that was a tiny sample. They've got 100,000 names so far, as I mentioned, which extrapolated looks a lot like about 1 million such organizations all over the world. Civilsociety.org will be where that, we should have my slides up actually. I got a black slide, but it's okay. Civilsociety.org and also naturalcapital.org will have material on that. Now, I need to bring up a slide which, one of the things which is pushing everything is new and better data. And I'm a guy who basically organized myself since being a student of Paul Ehrlich against the population explosion. And lo and behold, this is what's going on right now. Because you've got a crossover that's happening. The rural population is dropping. Urban population is skyrocketing. And this is an enormous event. We're right now, next year, by the UN figures, crossing into being a 50% urban world. That's in context that 200 years ago was 3% urban, 100 years ago was 14% urban. It's assumed it'll get on to 61% urban pretty soon. And nobody knows what the top is, but most developed countries and much of Latin America is 80% urban. This is huge because it is so many people in such a short time. Every week, 1.3 million new people in the cities, most of them moving there from the countryside, some being born there. That adds up to 70 million a year. It's been going on for a decade or two. It's showing no signs of slowing down. And in fact, some places it's speeding up. So yeah, we have this image of the Earth, and it changed everything. And it started the ecology movement to a large extent in the late 60s and early 70s. But then if you turn out the lights, turn out the sun, and look at the lights, this is also how we see the Earth now. It's an urban planet. It's a city planet. It looks a lot like the internet. It's basically a lot of connectivity, a lot of nodes, a lot of activity, a lot of energy burning there, Tom. That's our, somebody's paying for every little bit of that light. Okay, one of the main events is that cities have always been population sinks, and they are now. So what's happening is when people move to the cities, the magic number is the replacement rate for population is 2.1 children per woman, because you lose some. That means for every woman who doesn't have a kid, some other woman has got to have 4.2 just to stay even. And what's shocked the demographers is the rate went down to that replacement rate and then just keeps right on going all over the world. So there are many parts of the world now that are in severe negative population growth. So it looks like the thing I worried about, basically an infinite population happening in this century, in fact is going to level off somewhere between 7 and 9 billion and then head rapidly downward. So a good book on this, this is slides from Philip Longman, who wrote the book The Empty Cradle. And this is a moderate UN projection, which is based on stabilizing birth rate at 1.85 children per woman. But in the developed countries, it's already down to 1.56. So this is a very upward conservative population, suggesting that by 2300, we'd be back to what it was when I graduated from college, which was about 2.5 billion. So in other words, we've seen a doubling of human population in our lifetime. And that's incredible. That's a huge event. But it's the last doubling. And that's probably even a huger event. So we got used to a certain growth rate. And Phil's point is that the economics are going to be shifted by all of this. Bear in mind that most of those 2 billion people yet to come from the 6.5 we are now are going to be in the cities. And that's where the birth rate is lowest. So here's a chart that is nicely calibrated to have a crossover point right about now, where basically the elders are increasingly all over the world outnumbering the newborn coming on. That leads to a world that looks like this. The developing world is full of cities that are filling up. They're young. They're seriously young. But Europe and the oldest cities are full of old people. Japan is headed in the direction of Florida. It's going to be St. Petersburg all over. That is going to lead to a bunch of stuff that I'm sure that Tom is going to have columns to write about, because they're completely different worlds. Huge self-organizing cities of young people and old, very organized cities of old people, and the economic byplay between them is going to be very interesting to see. Well, as the countryside empties out, things change about it. I mean, this is a case all over the world. Wherever you go, the villages are emptying out. Syria, central Russia, when that control economy collapsed, a whole bunch of people just vacated, went to the cities. Even places like Faroe Islands, those are empty buildings. Bolivia, China. China has experienced 300 million people moving into the cities since 1950. They're expecting another 300 million people. And unlike any other society in the world that's having that, they're not experiencing shanty towns like everybody else, which is pretty remarkable. So where's everybody going? They're going toward the bright lights. They're going toward opportunity. They're going away from poverty. Some cases, they're going away from an environmentally pretty degraded landscape that they're stuck in out in the bush. They got a cousin that goes to town, they find a lot of opportunity there, they follow him, and things get better in town. Sometimes they go to places like Shanghai. More often they go to places like Kibera, squatter city outside of Nairobi. These are big. In fact, 2 sources I found say that the majority of the construction going on in the world today is being done in a self-organized way by squatters, criminals, in some people's view. But the economic activity, okay, here's Mumbai in India, 1/6 of the gross domestic product of the entire nation. You'd think they'd be crushed by this half-slum population they've got, but it's pretty active. So what's going on? Well, you go down in these places, and it's medieval, but it's active. There's stuff going on. That street is an urban street. There's everything you can want there, including internet cafes. The women are being liberated as soon as they move to town, and the support group becomes the neighborhood and the immediate family, and education is going on in a way it never could out in the countryside. Medical care, all the rest of the things. So you're seeing basically billions of people simultaneously climbing out of poverty with each other. These are by and large not groups that are crushed by poverty. They're people busy getting out of poverty as just as fast as they can. They're going to be using more energy, as Tom was pointing out. The numbers are incredible. Roughly 1 billion now live in slums and squatter cities. Now 2 billion more are expected. And that's terrible news or good news. And it's all of those things. It's these, poverty is rough. But the people are so resourceful and smart working on it that they figure out all sorts of things. So you want to see how really green urban living can be, go to a squatter city. They recycle everything. They're not using much material. They're not using much energy, sometimes because they have to steal it, but people are gradually working out ways to do that legally. And all of this resourcefulness and need and creativity is generating all kinds of interesting ideas. Now, one of the things environmentalists have done usefully in the last couple of years is talk about ecological footprint. usually in context of cities make this great big, therefore terrible ecological footprint. Partly that's being used to discourage sprawl in suburbs and push for more density. But what hasn't really happened yet is the kind of comparison that I think would be useful to compare the ecological footprint of the same quantity of people in their rural situations. Manhattan is an intensely green city. There was a good piece in the New Yorker a couple of years ago about that. As far as I know, nobody has studied the ecological footprint of squatter cities, but that would be something very much worth doing. Because, the slide says, look, it's heavier out, the footprint is heavier out in the countryside, and it is. So Greens need to take into consideration how to handle an urbanized planet. We don't have a lot of awareness yet. We don't have a lot of data yet how this works. I think we both need to protect the countryside and work on making the cities themselves more green. So go back to the romantics, the scientists. These are people like Jared Diamond, who's a hard-over ornithologist. Craig Venter will be here later. And you remember the romantics line up this way. I would say that the scientific environmentalists have a somewhat different frame of reference. Basically, they like to change their mind. Admitting mistakes is what science is made of. They lead environmental opinion, but it's slow, and because of that, most of the leading biodiversity-directed scientists will not admit that they're environmentalists in public because it embarrasses them. But in fact, I think the coolest people in the world are field biologists. They're the ones who keep biology honest. They're the ones who keep the whole environmental movement honest. I used to be one, actually. And it's leading to things like this. This is David Hillis, Danny Hillis's smarter younger brother, who was the first one to take the results of mitochondrial DNA study of 25,000 species, collected all into one big tree of life. And if you look closely, it'll take us up to that "you are there" thing. Let's see if it's actually going to do it. There we are, Homo sapiens. There is no type specimen for Homo sapiens, it turns out. It would be Linnaeus, and they didn't keep him in a museum long enough. So what's going on is a lot of discovery, a lot of study, the kind of thing that we used to work with the All Species Foundation to get lots more discovery going on. So you're finding incredible things like this. This was a squid that trimmed up at 11,000 feet. They still don't have a type specimen on this one because all they got was video images. And then we're getting very good views of what goes on inside the cells of a slowed down. Scientific visualization is getting so accurate, this is actually portraying the way structure functions inside cells. And so what you're seeing is you got Moore's law going up pretty rapidly. The increase of the ability to do sequencing and synthesizing DNA is going up far more rapidly. This is the biotech century coming on. And 2 years later, there's Rob Carlson's curves showing that they're continuing to accelerate right on up. My fellow environmentalists are completely worked up about genetically modified organisms. And I think it's a complete mistake. It's a visceral fear of what is seen as unnatural. The people who are trained in biology know that microbial stuff is doing this kind of thing all the time. And difficult genes have a very hard time in the wild. Furthermore, genetically modified crops tremendously reduce the pressure on the natural environment. And so people like Edward O. Wilson and Peter Raven take no part in the raging against it. And by the way, if you want to see who really likes genetically modified crops, try the Amish. The ones who hate technology except when it's really good. So moving right on to engineers, some important ones like Amory Lovins and Bill McDonough have come along and moved towards solutions. That's where a whole lot is going on in the environmental movement now, I think. But there's another kind of engineer who they disapprove of still, who's pushing on biotechnology. In this case, he broke the monopoly than Monsanto and others had on the kinds of biotechnology you can use for food crops, and is getting food to the people outside of that whole corporate approach to things. I think that if you look at things like invasive species, the Guam brown snake, kudzu, French broom, spartina, feral lilies, imported fire ants, zebra mussels, snakehead, cane toad, and the lamprey eel, these are things that there's not enough volunteers in the world to get rid of. They are completely destroying habitats they're in. It's going to take a biotech solution. Just to quickly move on to climate, if you've seen Al Gore's movie, now read the book that changed the dialogue in England, and is finally a year later the book has come to the US, Jim Lovelock's The Revenge of Gaia. Subtitle has it, Earth's Climate Crisis and the Fate of Humanity. I'll just point out that studies that we did a few years ago at Global Business Network for GBN have been pointing at a number of abrupt climate change triggers that potentially are going on. There's already signs of slowing down at the Gulf Stream in the far north of the Atlantic. The West Atlantic ice sheet, Antarctic ice sheet could cut loose because the Ross Ice Shelf is melting. That started when the Arctic tundra melts. It not only gets warmer because it's green instead of brown, instead of white, but it also releases methane. We're getting a slowing of the trade winds, which means a permanent El Nino. And the thing that everybody's worried about is the methane hydrates, the clathrates down at the bottom of the sea. Occasionally, triggers come along that affect public opinion and then give, in a sense, Greens more power if they know what to do with it, like the heat wave in Western Europe. 10 times more people died than in 9/11. India is running out of water. So just 7 years later, this nice lake with this marble palace in it, you could only get to by boat, now you can drive to it. The breakthrough for lots of Greens is understanding this diagram of Robert Sokolows, that if you think of the 7 stabilization wedges that could bring us down, there's one that stands out that has not been an environmental program up till now. And we've done fine at forests and soils and renewable electricity and efficiency, but nuclear fission, what's that about? Well, it has a kind of a bad reputation. When I talk to nuclear engineers, I always show this slide and they always jump. There's stuff that is out there that are workarounds that have been happening in this 50-year mature industry, such as the dry cask storage that you can put in places like out in the middle of Utah that the Indians wanted there. This is a perfectly decent place to put spent fuel while we think about it. You don't need to put it in a place for 10,000 years. There's a lot going on in the meantime. So take yourself to places like the Diablo Canyon in California. I think it's 14% of our energy in California comes from nuclear, about 20% in America. Thank goodness. Thank goodness the Greens led so much conservation to happen, but also I would say thank goodness that there's enough nukes that have happened. Any state that is lucky enough to have a nuclear reactor and public-spirited enough to have that, you must be very careful never to shut them down, because the Greens will be after you in a couple of years. Okay. And the coastal reactors are pretty interesting because there's all this water right here. There's heat. That can be desalinated with that energy. It can be turned into hydrogen with that energy. This becomes a complete green package, and nuclear starts to look like this, close to the end. That makes the nuclear engineers jump even more. Dan Jansen, who's the great protector of the natural environment in Costa Rica, the cloud forest, says, what you've got to understand is when you're talking about the natural environment, wilderness, and so on, it's all gardening. It's always been gardening. And it's not only all gardening, all been under human direction, but it's got to be commercial gardening. So you've got to add in an eco-tourist there. And in fact, those trees are there because that guy is there. That's how it works. These things have got to be economic. So what you've got is what's being referred to as a new epoch in geological history, the millions of years of how the Earth has gone so far. And an atmospheric scientist who got the Nobel Prize recently said, you know, we might as well call this new epoch the Anthropocene. This is the time when humans are actually directing in a large way how the Earth plays out. So, in fact, we are terraforming Earth. That's the game now. Might as well do it right. Thank you.